I'll be your timer. I'll give you a 2-minute warning at 5 minutes, 1-minute warning at 6. Time's up at 7. You have a 15-second grace period. And make sure you hit your sources.
All right. That's it. Okay. Imagine you are all addicted to heroin. Well, you probably can't for a multitude of reasons. First being you probably have hair. Instead, try to imagine 100 757 Boeings crashing into the sea every year. This is how DrugScope sees the annual rate of heroin overdose in the United States. Currently, the United States simply does not have an active plan for heroin interdiction. Beyond invading Afghanistan, there is little the United States has done to curb this horrible epidemic. I propose that we take a page from our European counterparts and instead prescribe and monitor the use and abuse of heroin by these addicts. So, firstly, let's address the issues of harms. For the individual and for society, there is a multitude of harms and reasons to essentially kick this addiction. Firstly, for the individual, heroin causes an ungodly need for money. And naturally, this causes the individual to seek an illicit profession, typically centering around prostitution or acquisitional theft. Now, for the individual themselves, this means a lot more run-ins with law enforcement, and additionally facing a system that doesn't see their mental condition as a problem, but really as a problem against societies. Furthermore, prostitutes forced into their profession by heroin addiction spread diseases both to the using population and to the non-using population. The Drug Policy Alliance found that 75% of new HIV cases in women and children were caused directly or indirectly by HIV or by IV heroin use. So by essentially cutting the heroin use and the dirty needle exchange, we can greatly curtail the amount of HIV that is being spread. So this leads to the second area of harms, the harms for society. Now, firstly, we have the crime issue, the acquisitional theft issue. Now, I bet there are many people in this room who may know somebody or may have themselves been a victim of a drug addict's crime. Even if not, in more urban areas, this figure skyrockets. And just beyond that area of direct harms, we see the harms of prostitution. Essentially, what prostitution does is it takes these diseases like hepatitis and HIV and it brings them into the non-using population. Now, the non-using population isn't as aware as the drug users of what these diseases do and how they are transmitted. And as such, we see spreads that are pretty much unrivaled in any disease. That's why we saw lives taken during the AIDS epidemic that were completely unrelated to the drug scene or the gay scene, most notably Isaac Asimov, the Russian scientist. Now, furthermore, in order to reduce these harms we see by prostitution and crime, we have to take a more proactive approach. We need a solution that's as old as the drug itself. This leads, essentially, to the satisfaction area. So, firstly, let's cover the more traditional and less controversial method, and that would be a substitute treatment. For example, we see a wide range of treatments from methadone to Subutex to Suboxone and morphine. A lot of these different medications have been tried for substitutes because they are opioid agonists, meaning that they act a lot like the same way our endorphins do, and thus how heroin does. So the range of treatments, they span from something that contains an opioid agonist to something that contains an antagonist. This spectrum includes drugs on the far end, such as Suboxone, and then on the furthest end, which would be morphine. Suboxone, on the furthest end, is the most punitive of drugs. It contains an agonist, which is good for the heroin effect, and an antagonist, which actually blocks the heroin effect. Suboxone would be given to someone who is sentenced to treatment by a court. Essentially, what happens with Suboxone is if it's crushed and injected, the antagonist stops the agonist effects from taking place, thus greatly reducing the amount of euphoria. On the other end of the spectrum, we have a morphine treatment. Now, morphine is a great deal like heroin itself, so for the user, it's a great substitute. But unfortunately, it keeps them in that same drug scene, and thus, when they get out of the treatment, there is little assurance that they will not return back to their drug. So, this leads to the only viable solution. We need a solution that is old as heroin itself. So thus, the best prescription for these addicts is heroin itself. Heroin addiction programs have been of this form are as old as 1920 and began in Britain. Britain recognized that on the small scale, doctors were getting addicted to their own medicine. So to contain this problem, they simply gave the doctors heroin for free. Now, during the 50s and 60s, this process was greatly downplayed because of the United States war on drugs. But then in 1994, Switzerland pioneered a program of heroin assistance treatment which involved monitoring and giving them these drugs. A PubMed.gov report found, in fact, that by giving them this heroin assistance treatment, they were able to have success rates equal or better than that of methadone groups, morphine groups, or Suboxone groups. Furthermore, PubMed found in Germany that by giving them the heroin assistance treatment, they were able to get them out of their situation, essentially remove them from their environment and allow them to get new friends. So that way when they went back from the outpatient treatment, they wouldn't have to essentially go back to those same friends and family who allowed them to become users in the first place. So these two PubMed studies are great support for the heroin assistance treatment program. But essentially, we need to confront this issue head on and realize that the benefits greatly outweigh the harms. So this leads us to the visualization step. Firstly, we see an overall decrease in crime and in the spread of disease. This is because the heroin addicts who once had to plague us for their addictions no longer have to. NIDA found that although 20% of American heroin addicts are in a methadone treatment process, still we see countless prostitution charges and assault charges regarding these individuals. So the true solution must then be to face it head on and allow them to explore their options their own way. So by allowing them to choose essentially when to come off of heroin and choose their own new environment, you decrease crime and you decrease prostitution. In the case of Switzerland and their long-term heroin assistance treatment program, the Lancet newspaper found that by medicalizing heroin, it created this negative schema for teenagers. Essentially, children thought the drug was more of a problem than a high. So thus, by creating this medical issue out of heroin, we can decrease the amount of usage out of people who haven't even seen it yet, thus defeating the biggest contention out of the naysayers for these heroin treatment programs. In conclusion, we have to look essentially at how we can tackle the heroin problem and how essentially we can stop the drug from getting into the country. And I'm trying to persuade you today to not only prioritize rehabilitation over criminalization, but to prioritize heroin assistance treatment over methadone treatment or morphine treatments because they have proven more effective by countless studies. Thank you.